Okay, so good evening, everyone. Good evening from the Philippines, and greetings from whatever time zone that you are tuning in to our session. So, for tonight's session, or for this session, I'll be talking about multidimensional thinking in compassionate democratization. Of course, I will be talking I will be discussing this topic with Ms. Kiana A. Urbano, the Vice Lead for External Affairs of the Compassion Connectors Philippines, the national chapter of the Global Compassion Coalition in the Philippines. So I am Nathan Navarro, the national lead for the Philippines of the Global Compassion Coalition, and I'm also representing here the Club of Rome as the Chief National Youth Representative for the Philippines. So, first off, we need to understand what compassion is. So, we are using Martha Nussbaum's elucidation of what uh, compassion is. Compassion, according to Martha Nussbaum, is a painful emotion directed at the serious suffering of another creature or creatures. So, meaning to say, it is expanding one's sensitivity and reception of suffering. So even if you're not suffering, you try to be um, sensitive, right? You try to be sensitive to the suffering of other people. You make it seem as if you're feeling that suffering, as if you're the one suffering. And then, but compassion is not limited only to the sufferings of others. It also involves the sensitivity to one's avoidable sufferings. So according to Dr. Christine Neff, having compassion for oneself is really no different than having compassion for others. So of course, it is derived from the Latin term, the Latin word com, which means with, and then passion, which means suffering. And also, first, to experience compassion, you have to actually notice that your friend, for instance, is struggling or feeling bad about themselves, and then or themselves. According a second, if you feel compassion rather than pity, you realize that suffering, failure, and imperfection are part of the shared human experience. Finally, you respond to your friend with warmth, understanding, and kindness, feeling the desire to help in some way. These are the three main components of compassion: mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. So, self compassion simply involves doing a U turn and giving yourself the same compassion you would naturally show a friend when you're struggling or feeling bad about yourself. It means being supportive when you're facing a life challenge, you feel inadequate, or you made a mistake. Okay, instead of just ignoring your pain with a stiff upper lip mentality, or getting carried away by your negative thoughts and emotions, you stop to tell yourself, this is really difficult right now. How can I comfort and care for myself in this present moment? So we need to recognize that we live in a democracy in which a pluralistic culture might be confusing, in which the search for the truth might be easily dismissed, in which meaning making might easily be bastardized, in which popularity might override integrity, in which individuals abuse their power to make a choice, in which a popular culture only cultivates political culture only cultivates individualistic and apathetic citizenry, in which compassion is rarely practiced genuinely. So these are the possibility of democracy. And in this democratic environment, we might not be able to fully appreciate what compassion really is. However, for Martha Nussbaum, democratic education and culture are the key ingredients for cultivating emotional responses and civic understanding, which ultimately foster a compassionate environment. More than a spontaneous and sporadic activity of democratization, the cultivation of a compassionate environment has emotional yet reasonable standards. In short, there are logical components, there are rational components in compassionate understanding, in compassionate action. So, what is the basic structure of compassion according to Nussbaum? So, first, there is a thought of seriousness. The person who feels the emotion thinks that someone else is suffering in some way that is important and non trivial. For example, we don't feel compassion for rich people who suffer when they pay their taxes if we think that it is exactly right that they should pay their taxes. So in this sense, you go to the roots of the system or of the condition of the human of the conditions of the human experience, right? So you don't simply judge someone as crying to be someone worthy of feeling of basically having felt a compassion. So basically it creates a form of a serious directionality towards the conditions, the objective conditions, and not merely the emotional and subjective standards. There is also the thought of non-fault. We typically do not feel compassion if we think the person's predicament is chosen or self-inflicted. So even when we do feel compassion for people whom we also blame, the compassion and the blame typically address different phases or aspects of the person's situation. Thus, we may blame a criminal for a criminal act while feeling compassion for him if we think that the fact that he got to be the sort of person who commits criminal acts is in large part an outgrowth of social forces. So you don't simply rely on labels, on normative standards. You also you basically uh, go through the meticulous uh, process of understanding in order to basically realize if someone truly deserves um, compassion or compassionate feeling or passionate action. But compassion is different from empathy. Empathy is simply the ability to imagine the situation of the other, taking the other's perspective. Empathy is not mere emotional contagion, for it requires centering into the predicament of another, and this in turn requires some type of distinction between the self and the other, and a type of imaginative displacement. Okay, so it's just taking the shoes of basically another person, but it is not sufficient for compassion. For a sadist may have considerable empathy with the situation of another person and use it to harm that person. Lawyers may use empathy with a witness to help their clients by confusing or tripping up the witness. An actor may have consummate empathy with his or her character without any true compassion. To experience compassionate democratization, therefore, involves a dialogical rethinking of our biases, beliefs, and assumptions, and even the limits of our knowledge and experiences. It is a collective endeavor and not merely a one-man job. It involves a disposition to challenge oneself and not merely to defeat the other's arguments and perspectives. It flourishes based on our willingness to open our hearts and minds to what is true, even if it means abandoning our old ways of thinking and living. It derives its power from individuals who want to create a community of lifelong learning. This is where we see the significance of fostering caring, creative, and critical thinking. It is a call to appreciate multi-dimensional thinking to deliver appropriate compassionate action and living. So, caring thinking, according to Matthew Lipman, involves a double meaning. For on the one hand, it means to think solicitously about that which is subject matter of our thought, and on the other hand, it is to be concerned about one's manner of thinking. of thinking. Thus, for example, a man writing a love letter writes lovingly to the person to whom the letter is addressed, while at the same time, he is anxious about the letter itself. And thus, caring is a kind of thinking when it performs such cognitive operations as scanning for alternatives, discovering or inventing relationships, instituting connections, engaging differences. And yet, it is of the very nature of caring to obliterate distinctions and ranking when they threaten to become invidious and thereby outlive their usefulness. Thus, caring parents recognizing that being human is not a matter of degree, just as being natural is not a matter of hierarchy, do not attempt to assign ranking to their children. And yet at the same time, they recognize that there are significant differences of perspective so that things have different proportions in one perspective than they have in another. So it is a radical transformation of monolithic understanding. It is welcoming differences, and yet though the very recognition of difference um, must transcend invidious discrimination. Caring thinking diminishes the desire to see philosophical exercises and discursive analysis as a pure arena of ideas whereby a certain person needs to be trampled by one's power. The evaluative aspect of philosophical discussion is guided by a spirit that thinks caringly for the humanity of all the participants. As such, it creates a collective mindset to resolve issues and clarify contradictions as a social task rather than taking it merely as a segment to bring shame to those who have committed mistakes or have provided arguments and claims that have been debunked. To care for the search for the truth is to care for our shared love for wisdom. In fact, every mistake taken and addressed is not merely seen as a weakness, but rather as a sign of caring to build a stronger commitment towards the discovery of the truth. Valuation is a critical process of learning which pertains to the ways in which people in different walks of life do in fact decide value matters. The roles of desires and preferences, the role of evidence, the ways in which priorities are set, the employment of casuistry and of logic, the recourse to due process, the reliance on bureaucratic regulations and use of discretion. In short, our philosophical exercise and judgment is never or are never neutral. But these are based on our evaluative commitment to care for the common search of the truth. So creative thinking, in the past, according to Lippmann and Margaret Sharp and Frederick Oskanian, in the past, we have treated the faulty inferences that have resulted from invalid thinking as just so much intellectual trash. But there are so many others to which fantasy and make believe are quite appropriate. For instance, logical fallacies can help encourage the child to consider counterfactual situations. It is logically invalid to deduce from the statement all onions are vegetables that all vegetables are onions. But if children are encouraged to contemplate what a world would be like in which all vegetables were onions, they may very well delight in thus picturing to themselves its details. One would cry when peeling carrots, smell onions every time one slices potatoes, and so on. Obviously, this does more than liberate the children's imagination. It frees their inventiveness as well. Creative thinking is not just about becoming imaginative for the sake of creativity. Its innovation lies in the collaborative confrontation of the limits of one's experiences, knowledge, and interpretation. To deliver a new insight about social order, ethical solutions, understanding about beauty and knowledge, among others, there is a need to guard the freedom to create a new arrangement of thinking and design experimentation. Creative thinking also involves shaking up our life experiences and trying to reinvent ways to analyze them with literary and artistic prowess. Thus, aside from engagement and interest that is being fostered by creative thinking, it also allows the participants of the discussion to become aware of their old ways of thinking that can be changed instead of treating such as the ultimate standards of what is true, right, and beautiful. Thus, it tries to bring to the fore the demarcation between what is really possible from what is not, which is a matter of understanding that should not merely be bequeathed by unquestioned tradition and unexamined biases. So, in elucidating critical thinking, we need to understand that first, critical thinking facilitates judgment because it relies on a criteria, whatever that criteria is. It is self-correcting. Critical thinking is a disposition to correct oneself, and it is also a context-sensitive disposition, right? So it seems reasonable to conclude, therefore, that there is some sort of logical connection between critical thinking and criteria and judgment. The connection, of course, is to be found in the fact that critical thinking is reliable thinking, and skills themselves cannot be defined without criteria by means of which allegedly skillful performances can be evaluated. So critical thinking is reliable thinking that both employs criteria and can be assessed by appeal to criteria. So for instance, we may ask questions in a community of inquiry, what reasons do you have for saying that? Why do you agree or disagree on that point? How are you defining the term you just used? What do you mean by that expression? Is what you are saying now consistent with what you said before? Okay, so while there are no perfect formulas for for this philosophical objective, it doesn't mean that teachers must not guide the participants to further their reasonableness. Some comments from children need not be examined thoroughly, but some might be pursued with great vigor and argumentative prowess by eliciting the participation of all the participants in a community of inquiry. The crucial key to this indeterminacy is the goal to promote reasonableness and not merely to elicit opinion. Okay, so it is also a clarification that while the COI or the community of inquiry is tolerant of differences of interpretation and other forms of disagreement, it does not mean that these are not to be corrected, much less meticulously discussed. In a COI, what matters is that the contributions from each participant relate to and reinforce one another as each participant learns from what the others have said and indeed learns from his or her own contributions. And as each successive contribution to the discussion reflects the successive increments of understanding that the participants has amassed. So basically, verbalization here is not the benchmark, the end all and be all of a community of inquiry, but it is the reasonable philosophical judgment that is, of course, constructed by the participants themselves. So for the interest of time, I will just be skipping these parts, but I will be happy to discuss it if we have some time left. So some socioeconomic struggles that need compassionate understanding and the dialogical examination of various rationalities. Much of the environmental, for instance, this is an excerpt from Agustin Martin Rodriguez from Repentance and from his book Repentance and Rebirth at the End of Life as We Know It. Much of the environmental degradation in the world is caused by marginalized people trying to earn a living in the peripheries of the mainstream society. In major cities of the Philippines, the informal settlers contribute much to the population of the waterways. This is because they dwell in hazardous areas where public services and utilities do not exist, and they have no choice but to dump their trash and their bodily refuse into the canals. These In this country too, many jungles are denuded because of the slash and burn methods of forest clearing by caingeros or Sweden farmers. These caingeros are again the marginalized nomadic farmers who were driven from their fields by colonial invaders or the mestizo progeny to the mountains and were deprived of arable land. So you see pressure, not necessarily a pressure that is unreasonable, and pressure that is some inducing, you know, illogicality, plain illogicality, but this is, it creates a rupture in our understanding. It creates, it magnifies the contradictions in our social reality in order to basically have a dialogue and tell to ourselves that maybe the solutions that we are trying to impose are not really the solutions that we really need as a collective society and not just a fragmented one, right? And to continue, many fisher folks observe their catch is dwindling and that their practice is affecting the sustainability of their livelihood, thus depleting the, of course you see the depleting fish populations as destroying and destruction of the coral reefs in fishing grounds. So of course they use cyanide and dynamite fishing, but how we can also notice that Dr. Rodriguez created a very compelling, a very I would say cathartic sort of statement. However, they need to respond to their daily needs, and when the buying price of their catch is kept low by the middlemen, they have no choice but to increase their catch as much as they can. These decisions that are destroying various biomes are made with survival in mind. This could actually be seen to be inventive responses to dire situations by different human beings who are on the periphery of society. Some of these people are even aware, right? But they feel they have no choice, right? So it creates a demand for a dialogue by really capturing the caring and creative, thinking of the readers, basically, by creating a more expansive narrative to basically question our consciousness. So here, we can also see this in Wataru Kosaka's book, Moral Politics in the Philippines, Inequality, Democracy, and Urban Poor. Dr. Wataru Kosaka said, the reason why so many poor people supported candidates from the entertainment industry was not only because of their celebrity status, but also because it was thought that they might be more approachable than conventional politicians. Politicians who are artists or performers are better because they are close to the masses. Other politicians are only close to the rich. However, there is no evidence that candidates from the entertainment industry could actually help the people. Most candidates lost in the senatorial elections of 2007, of the year 2007. So you see here the narrative that is replete with, of course, personal accounts of based on anthropological studies, ethnographic research, but also you can see here the analytic, the more critical approach of Wataru Kosaka. So you see here the interspersed approach towards caring, creative, and critical thinking. Okay. So another issue is the middleman aspires to create a better Philippines over the long term by choosing the right leaders through an electoral process based on rational policy debates in line with the aforementioned values. On the other hand, the poor, due to their more precarious circumstances, support candidates who seem likely to solve the problems that press upon them in relation to land or residence or and other necessities of life. As a result, even voter education that appeals to universal values cannot readily change the voting behavior of the poor. So basically, it's not just about relying on critical thinking, but also caring. It also it is also nourished by a caring disposition to understand social contradictions and the very causes of social fragmentation without necessarily becoming so impulsive, but to really understand the what's this again, what made these problems possible, right? The possibility of having this experience, what made these human sufferings, right, possible. So it's a very systemic kind of narrative, right? A very system oriented narrative. So this is also this can also be seen by those who simply label, right? Uh, those what is again, those who are the vendors rather, uh, in the on the sidewalks rather, and you can simply label them as, unclean, unhygienic, obstructions to progress. They're just causing, traffic jams, and other um, bottlenecks, right, to development and or economic progress. But as you can see here, and I need to quote at length, this very creative narrative that captures that captures a demand for a more dialogical thinking. So according to Rodriguez in his another book, Governing the Other, many of these vendors cannot be accommodated by the formal structures of urban society, although many of them dreaming of becoming integrated members of this society, either as factory workers, office personnel, or government employees. Actually, their ambition to tap into the Manila dream, Manila is the capital city of the Philippines, is not so complicated or high. They merely want work which can absorb them into systems that guarantee income, security of tenure, stability, respectability, and the semblance of belonging and contributing to the centers of power and commerce. However, because of the lack of any marketable skills, or any skills that would make them unique, desirable, and indispensable to the institutions of commerce and industry, they are left at the margins. They do not have security of tenure, no chance of upward mobility, and the most they can do is eke out a living by selling products of the quality and price that appeal to those who are just as poor as they are, or just a little better off. So you see here a again a magnification of social contradictions, uh, basically trying to decenter the dominant rationality of development, with basically feeds off our ego of what success is, of what growth is, of what personal achievement is. So anyway,
So
I am now passing the I'm now passing the floor to Miss Kian Urbano.
Hello. Hi. Hi. So can we show the presentation that I have prepared for this talk? So again, while Mr. Navarro is fixing up the presentation for the second half of this talk, I just like to introduce myself again. Hello, everyone. My name is Kiana Urbano. I am the Vice Lead for External Affairs at the Compassion Connectors Philippines, which is the local chapter of Global Compassion Coalition. I am truly honored to present before you, and I will be presenting again the second half of this talk, which is very much relevant to what Mr. Navarro have mentioned a while back, especially about the growth and this superstitious growth that we have, well, technically in the Philippine setting. And so we will be exploring how economic data can give us very much a wider perspective, or like this multi-dimensional thinking on how systems needs intensified integration of compassion and understanding as well. And so to start, Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I just want to give a gist of what we'll talk about. Let's start with introduction, a little bit of introduction about the Republic of the Philippines. Um, the Philippines is an archipelagic nation in Southeast Asia with diverse culture, histories, and equalities. It is a democratic society, which is shaped by the colonial past, and the political dynasties that still exist today, and as well as the global market forces. And majority of um, uh, portion of the sectors that's driving the economy of the Philippines is coming from the service sector. And example of it would be, BPO or tourism. Part of it would come from the remittances we get from OFWs and the infrastructure development. Okay, so moving on, just to give a positive light to the country, let's look at the positive economic data that we can get from the Philippines and their economy today. So here on your screen is the this is the real GDP growth year-on-year percentage. Basically, the economy of the Philippines sustains a very steady growth in the quarter one of 2025 amid the domestic and external challenges that it has. Um, and we can see here that the real GDP growth continues to increase from 5.2% in quarter three of 2024 to 5.4% in quarter one 2025. Now, moving on with the next slide, we can see the national government outstanding debt, meaning that the debt structure in the Philippines remain resilient as well. So the debt to GDP ratio sits at 17.4% for external source and 37.2% rather for domestic one. Now, moving on to our gross national reserve, we can see here the foreign exchange reserves continues to provide a strong external buffer for the Philippines. So foreign exchange revenue sits at 104 billion at the end of the April 2025. And moving on, let's keep on having these uh, data. Okay, so now we have the remittances that we get from the OFWs, and which are steady. This is a very steady source of income for the Philippines. Remittances from OFWs, workers, consistently illustrated an upward trend from 2.6 billion to 34.5 billion now in 2024. Now, if we look at the Philippines, okay, let's move on. The Philippines, when compared to other Southeast Asian, Philippines remains strong and fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia based on their real GDP growth year-on-year percentage. Now we can see here that starting from 2021, the Philippines displayed real GDP growth, with shifts not falling short or exceeding 4% until 2025. So if we can see here um, in our uh, economic growth or the data that we have presented, we can say that yeah, this is good news. We're doing great. I mean, the numbers are high. We are growing economically. We're expanding the economy, and this is the indicators that we want to see. So let's move on to the next slide. So from these economic growth, we've seen there is an evident economic growth, yeah, economic growth in the Philippines. So it is a positive thing. That's what we want to see, and we desire that as a country. But then, um, if we look at the next slide, we are now posed with different data that says otherwise. So this is a survey asking Filipinos if they consider themselves poor, borderline, or not poor. From 1991 to 2000, the percentage of people considering themselves poor played around 55 to 70%. Now, in our next slide, this is the same survey from 2021 to 2025. The percentage of people considering themselves as poor is around 45 to 63%. So not much of a change even after 34 years. So that is questionable. Why is it the people, even though the economy expanding, they view themselves as poor? And that's, you know, during that long time already, 34 years, or even, over 20 34 years. And so the next slide will help us also see that in the healthcare sector of the Philippines, we are very much, not doing really great in this sector. And only 2 out of 17% in the Philippines have met the World Health Organization's recommended ratio of 10 doctors per uh, 10,000 population. And so this is really uh, an issue in the Philippines, that there's a regional disparity in terms of the access and even quality of the health services that we get. And so, lastly, in our next slide, we would that the Philippines also face food insecurity and hunger in the Philippines, and that is very sad. We have 37.8 million Filipinos who are severely food insecure, and that is the highest in the Southeast Asia for 2022 to 2024. And that is happening despite, the Philippines being one of the fastest growing economies. We have 51 million Filipinos who cannot afford a healthy diet. That is second highest in the Southeast Asia. 13.7 million Philippine families consider themselves poor. That is 49% of the total number of Filipino families. And lastly, we have 4.5 million families which experience involuntary hunger. So clearly, there is this immense gap between the quote unquote economic growth that we are experiencing to the lived experiences of many Filipinos. And this poses this question. Our next slide. Uh, this question emerges from all of these information that we get up until this point. If the economy is growing, why do poverty, inequality, and unemployment remain deeply rooted in our society? And so, one thing that we will be exploring today is because of the differences in the positionalities and rationalities that many people have. So, not only Filipino people, no, but people may have in a society. And so, here we have economic indicators. They are not neutral. They are very much interpreted through different positionalities, and that is the social, economic, and geographic, factors. We have political interests and rationalities, or how people think or value things. And just to have an example, for instance, economic reports from the economic agency from the Philippines, IMF, International Monetary Fund, they often celebrate macro indicators as GDP or FDI, foreign direct investment, inflation control. But these fails to capture the lived experiences of the poor, our informal workers, and geographically isolated areas, basically the marginalized sector. And so moving on, just to go a little bit way back to the early establishment of, divisions or classes, in order for us to appreciate and really think through how positionalities are created. So we are tapping into Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto from 1848. And so, in this revolutionary work of Karl Marx, he divided social classes based on ownership of resources. So, we have the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, and the proletariat. And this also gives us a very much understanding of how these classes develop its own rationality. And so in the diagram in the next slides, we'll be able to see the bourgeoisie and proletariat. Bourgeoisie, these are the owner or capitalists who control factors of productions and profits from the labor exerted by the workers, or proletariat. The proletariat, these are the workers who sell their labors to capitalists to earn a minimum wage for survival. So Marx argued that this division technically creates the capitalist society. And bourgeoisie defends their private property and profit, while the proletariat seeks an adequate compensation for their labor. Now, moving on, let's bring us back to the modern time and really check what's the well-known measurement that we have today in order to uh, understand positionality. And one of them is this, the World Bank country classification by income level for 2024. So they have um, four main classifications, that is high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income. And in the next slide, we'll be able to see the regional highlights from this country classification. For time's sake, I will not be discussing it further, but technically, what it says, it really tells us how, in different countries, we are classified by income, and that gives us and establish a position in the society and in the global world, I would say. But moving on, I guess, to the lens of the Philippines. Here we can see on our screens that if we look at the PH alone, we have a three income classes. That is the lower income, middle income, and high income. In the next table, we'll be able to have a clear view of the income classes and the respective income cluster that we have here, and that is from the poor up until to the rich. And so to have a comparison and idea of how much this means, I have converted the values to US dollars based on the October 25 exchange rate. That is for $1, that means 58 pesos in the Philippines. But it is very much important to note that the purchasing power of these values may is very much different given a different cost of living in the Philippines, and because they have a very distinct economic conditions. And so just to have for our global viewers to have an idea on how we divide these income levels. Yep. So now these measurements and classifications establish a certain position in the society. So it inevitably teaches us a different truth system based on the inequality or luxury that we experience, and understanding that this complexity, and being able, of course, to show compassion to one's economic footing and how in their lived experiences. And so to appreciate at this point rationality and how it is shaped, we are now going to tap on Michel Foucault's series of lecture in 1978, which materializes basically how rationalities operate in system, or in society rather. So Foucault believed that societies are governed by certain rationalities. And we can very much see this in politics, wherein rationalities of those elites or and technocrats are only visible while other marginalized sectors are not seen at all. So this is how politics work, and how even in democratic spaces there is still a dominant perspective and rationality that overpowers the minority. So understanding these conditions makes us realize how compassionate, or compassion rather, even though it is a construct, even though it is unquantifiable, is a scarce resource today. So to tap on the marginalized sector, you'll be able to see here a very much different rationalities because they have different economic footing. Marginalized sectors basically include women, children, elderly people, informal workers, and migrant workers. So here, these marginalized groups are very vulnerable, and often they live in poverty because they have limited access to certain resource like healthcare, education, employment, and even the justice system. Now, moving on, in order for us to really understand how these different truth system rationalities play and how they interpret such certain economic growth in their own rationality. So for time's sake, let's uh, only tap on with our first, the massive infrastructure spending, the Build program, which exists right now in the current administration of the President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So in this economic growth, massive infrastructure spending, we can see here that the different rationalities have very much different lenses of truth. They interpret this economic growth differently. So the capitalist rationalities and the elites frame it as a development progress and a symbol of strong governance and land value. Even business expansion growth. And so they view it really positively, this specific economic growth, while the middle class rationality, they view this as it's a mixed blessing, you know. They view it as, you know, it's a good thing because it improves our transport access, but burden because the access will increase, or inflation from that financing will you know, boost or increase. While we can see here in the marginalized side and the working class rationality, we can see them very much affected by this economic growth. They see it as a displacement and disruption. So poor families are relocated, informal workers lose space for livelihood. And so it's very different. It's a different way of seeing things. The truth that we see, depending on the rationalities and positionalities that they have, really interpret economic data very differently. And so in the next slide, it really, uh, the whole point of this presentation really materializes to this. Economic growth is not economic development. So in essence, growth is just about numbers rising, although we don't want to discredit, you know, economic growth, because definitely we want that, but we don't want that result alone. It's not the outcome that we want. What we want is to really see that economic growth to really dive into being economic development. And development is about lives improving. So we need to see that this economic growth is really resonating. The impact is really resonating from the grassroots and smaller communities and marginalized sector. And so, next slide, let's go back to our topic, multidimensional thinking and compassionate democratization. As much as this entire presentation is filled with technicality and data, this points to deep narratives, emotions, and positionalities. The very main point of this presentation is not technical at all, but compassion entirely. It is a democratic system for the compassion, which can be quantified by economics. We used economics basically to appreciate compassion and empathy in democratic spaces. And democratic spaces should be grounded in compassion. It means understanding and respecting different rationalities and positionalities that we have mentioned earlier. It is vital to value how the middle class and elite each interpret progress. And so at this point, hopefully we gain a broader perspective on how compassionate democratization can be attained when these positionalities and rationalities are considered and heard. And at this point of our presentation on multidimensional thinking and compassionate democratization, we hope you have taken something meaningful in this discussion. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If anyone rather has a what is again a question or a comment, we really welcome them. So you can just simply message us through our accounts, or you can just simply chat us right now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kiana.
Thank you po.